Hello, everybody, 406 students. This is a video that will help you plan your content and literacy objectives, your standards, and your assessments for your lesson plan, which all is part of your lesson plan portfolio for this class. So in this video, we'll be answering how do I design learning objectives that relate to my students' present needs based off of the teaching context that you've collected. How do I develop content and literacy objectives that relate to each other? So remember, 406 is a class that is helping you learn how to teach literacy, right? So for this video, we'll talk about how do you incorporate literacy into your lessons. So we'll start off with talking about content and academic language objectives. Then we'll talk about choosing standards. Please note for this video, we are not focusing on ELD standards. That will be in a separate video. And then at the end, we'll talk about designing informal and formal assessments. So let's start with your content objective. Consider your diagnostic data. So if you remember, you gave them a literacy assessment. And so based off of that, what do you know that your students need to work on? Create a content-based objective that helps students practice a literacy skill that came up in that diagnostic. So for example, maybe they need to work on reading comprehension. Maybe they didn't quite understand the text that you gave them. Maybe they need to work more on writing a summary or making a claim about a text, citing evidence, or using academic language. So when you're coming up with your content objective, there are 3 components that you want to make sure is in there. So there's the input. So what are you including in your lesson? Are you doing a lecture? Are you doing a certain activity? Are you giving them a tool to use? What level of analysis are you having students use in your lesson? So that's the students will be able to part of your objective. And then what is the assessment? So how are you checking for understanding, right? So in the objectives that I'm about to show, you can use the words by, completing, or through, or the words using, right? So I think it'll make more sense when I show you the examples. So here's one example. So say you want your students to focus on reading comprehension. This is one objective. Given several word problems, students will be able to identify the most important info needed to determine the correct answer through an annotation exercise, right? So notice the input here are word problems. This is in a math class. Notice the level of analysis is identifying important info. And then the assessment is that they're going to do an annotation exercise, right? And this is based off of a diagnostic where you notice that students needed to better understand how to unpack a word problem, right? You might notice that maybe they need to focus on writing a summary instead. So this is one example for that. Given a primary document on World War II, students will be able to summarize the main consequences of Pearl Harbor using a graphic organizer. So notice the assessment here is a graphic organizer, right? And in this case, they're focusing on summarizing because you notice that in the diagnostic, they need work on improving their summary skills. Maybe you want to work on making a claim about a text. So this is an example from an English class. Given a mini lecture on ethos, pathos, logos arguments, students will be able to evaluate which arguments are the most persuasive by completing an exit slip, right? So in this case, the assessment is an exit slip. Here's one about citing evidence. Given sentence starters and examples, students will be able to give examples to support their opinions about Selena in a 5-sentence paragraph, right? So maybe this is a Spanish class, the English class, music class, I don't know. But again, notice that the focus is on giving examples because you want them to improve their ability to cite evidence here. And then finally, here's one on using academic vocabulary. Let me get out of your way here. Given a description at each fitness station, this is for a PE class, students will be able to use academic language on their exit slips to explain the reasoning for specific exercises, right? So again, notice these are very content specific. Notice that they have very specific skills. Students will be able to blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, there's a clear assessment that shows how students will show their understanding in your lesson. Okay, so let's move on to academic language, right? So in your lesson plan template, you're also going to need to figure out what is your academic language objective. The first thing you want to do is choose what vocabulary you want to focus on. And I don't know, I forgot who came up with this, but somebody came up with the idea that there are either brick vocabulary, brick terms, or mortar terms. So a brick term is like content specific vocabulary. So you can think of it in terms of this image here. It's like the building blocks of your content. It's all the like specific things that you find in your standards, basically, right? So in a history class, it could be different historical moments or specific people. The mortar terms or more academic skills-based vocab that are used across the content area. So things like analyze or use evidence or summarize, right? Those are things that are used across different subject areas. So for example, this is from an English class. Analyze the theme of the story and how the protagonist grew as a result of the resolution. So imagine this is a content objective, right? So if you were choosing an academic language objective, you might focus on the word analyze, which is more of a mortar term. Or your academic language objective might focus more on the words theme, protagonist, and resolution. So this is a history objective. Provide evidence to explain the demise of Trump's fascist government. That's my wishful thinking. So notice here the words evidence and explain are more of those mortar terms, right? So you figure out if you want to focus more on those kinds of terms and front loading those, or maybe you want to focus more on the content related terms, which is like fascism or government, right? I hope that makes sense. So after choosing what vocab you want to focus on, determine how you want students to understand and or use these words, right? So if this is at the beginning of a unit, are you introducing the terms? Are you helping students define them? Maybe if it's more in the middle of a unit or the end of a unit, they're applying them. Maybe they're evaluating them, right? Think of terms in when we did our group lessons and the ways in which you all were front loading vocabulary, right? So how are you having students use the words in your lesson? So here's one example from Pablo from a PE class. So notice his content objective is all about these things. So balance, reaction time, agility, blah, 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 blah. So given those skill related components, students will be able to physically apply each of the components by performing 5 repetitions in each station. So that's the content objective, right? But if you look at the academic language objective, it's taking these words and having students use them. So given those terms, students will be able to define and explain each term from the fitness stations in their checklist card. So again, notice they're not separate, the content and the academic language objectives. It should be really clear on how they relate to each other. Okay, so here's the standards. For your content standards, just choose the best content standard that aligns with your content objective. I really encourage you to just focus on one. There's like so many content standards, but as far as the CalTPA is concerned, they want to know that you're just choosing the appropriate ones, right? And then also, this is only for math, science, history, PE, or music classes. You also need to choose a literacy standard. So CalTPA wants to know that you are explicitly incorporating literacy into your lessons, right? So you're going to go to this website. There's a link in the folder this week, and choose a literacy standard that aligns with your learning objectives. So when you go to this website, you'll see this area on that website, and then just click on the appropriate subject and then figure out which literacy standard aligns with your lesson. Here's one example, again from Pablo's lesson. So he chose 1.3. Make sure that you put the number on there Again, CalCPA wants to know that you're choosing the right one, so just do that. And write out the whole standard. That's important too. And then notice for the literacy standard, he chose determine or clarify the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases based on grades 9 through 10 reading and content, right? So again, that directly applies to the fact that he's having these students use these PE specific words in his lesson, right? Okay, finally, assessment. So for the lesson plan template, you're gonna come up with an assessment, and it should already be pretty clear if you came up with a really good content objective. So remember the examples that I just showed you, there should always be your assessment at the end of that objective. For this lesson plan template, you need to come up with a formal assessment. So how are you checking for understanding at the end of your lesson? What work are you collecting to show what students were able to learn? And then informal assessment, how are you checking for understanding throughout your lesson? And how are you adjusting your teaching to support students where they are? So when I remember the group lessons that we were able to see this semester, a lot of you were really good at doing informal assessments, right? You would pause and you would notice like, students don't really understand the directions, so I'm gonna restate them, right? Or you were going around as people were discussing and you were listening in on people's conversations, right? That's informal assessment. So here's a little bit more info on the difference between formal and informal assessments. So remember, formal assessments evaluate student learning. They're usually at the end of the unit, but in this case, it's happening at the end of your lesson. It should have a rubric. If you have time, you should create a rubric. If you don't have time, it's cool this semester. So some examples, it could be a written response, a quiz, a graphic organizer, an exit slip, annotations that you're collecting, right? If this is more at the end of a unit, it would be like a larger project, like a test, a project, an essay, a presentation. For informal assessments, remember this is how you're monitoring students' ongoing learning throughout the lesson, right? And it's mainly to inform and improve your teaching. It's like really good info for you to see like, are they getting it? Do I need to slow down? Are they bored? Do I need to quicken the pace, right? It helps students identify strengths and weaknesses, targeting where to focus. And so these are some examples you can incorporate into your lesson to do informal assessment. So again, checking in on students' conversations or just asking for verbal responses. Annotation, right? So as you're noticing how students are annotating the text, you might see that students are getting certain things and maybe need to refocus on other areas. Whiteboard responses are a really cool way to do informal assessment. Graphic organizers, word problems. There's also the thumbs up, sideways or down. Show me if you really get it. We can move on. Are you kind of getting it sideways, or am I totally confused right now? Like, or do I need to slow down, right? So those are different forms of assessment. Okay, so next steps. Start with your content objective. That's the most important. Use your diagnostic data to figure out what literacy skill you want to focus on. For those of you who are working with a cooperating teacher, they might already give you your content objective. Maybe they want you to focus on a specific skill. So start with that. Then from there, figure out what your academic language objective is, right? So what word or words do you want to focus on? Try not to focus on too many. How will you front load them, and how will students need to engage with that vocabulary, right? So are you choosing a content specific word? Are you focusing more on like more on a general kind of term like analyze or summarize, right? Then see the standard links to help you determine which content and literacy standards to use, right? So plug those in. And remember to use the whole language of the standard and plug that into your lesson plan template. And then from there, figure out what your formal and informal assessments are. Remember, they should directly relate to your learning objectives, right? So again, if you have a strong and clear content objective, your assessment should be pretty clear already. You can look at the portfolio examples if you need them. I'm also sharing Liz's example in this folder, so you can take a look at that. And then if you have questions, post them on the discussion board. If you want to share ideas with folks so they can see more examples, please share them on the discussion board. And that's it. I will see you in the next video. If you want to, I'll be talking about ELD standards.